All right, so imagine you hired a financial advisor, and years later you found out they'd been quietly sending a slice of your retirement savings to your country's biggest adversary, without ever telling you. That's not a hypothetical. What you're about to see is Senator Pete Ricketts forcing a panel of financial experts to admit, out loud, on the record, that most Americans have no idea their index funds are funneling money into Chinese Communist Party-linked companies through a legal loophole so buried even your fund manager probably glossed over it. The experts didn't push back, they just confirmed it. And that's the part that should make you stop scrolling.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nebraska businesses are the economic center of communities across my state. Excessive federal red tape forces many Main Street businesses to compete on an unlevel playing field. That's why I introduced the Elevate Act with Senator Cortez Masto and partnered with Senator Gallego to introduce the HALOS Act. Both bills will make it easier for small enterprises to unlock available capital and drive our local economies forward. And as has been mentioned here today, the United States has the strongest, most trusted capital markets in the world, and it's because of the regulatory structure that we have in place. Our system relies on clear rules, reliable disclosures, and enforcement that is predictable and grounded in law. Fair and transparent regulations allow our country to have the most liquid, transparent markets in the world. And those standards matter even more in a time of strategic competition against Communist China. Communist China is not just another foreign market participant. Communist China is our greatest existential external threat. They are a strategic competitor with a state-directed economy. According to the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, roughly 286 China-based companies were listed on U.S. exchanges as of March 2025. Combined together, that represents about $1.1 trillion in market capitalization. That means that a meaningful share of American retirement accounts, mutual funds, and index funds routinely have exposure and hold these securities in their portfolios. American retirement savings are flowing into China-backed companies operating outside the reach of U.S. regulatory oversight and protections. It means Americans' retirement dollars and our markets are used to promote Communist China's businesses. That's why I introduced the No China Index Funds Act last June, because the retirement savings of everyday Americans should never be funneled into companies controlled by Communist China by default, without those Americans ever having made that choice. 151 of those 286 China-based issuers represent about 90% of the total market cap, and they use variable interest entity, right? They're a variable interest entity, VIE arrangements. They use these structures because China law restricts foreign ownership in key sectors, so they can't sell equity in the operating company directly to U.S. investors. Instead, investors buy shares in an offshore holding company that relies on contracts, not ownership. Mr. Benson, Mr. Flood, Mr. Dumas, yes or no, do you believe that the average American retail investor understands that difference today? Mr. Benson, we'll start with you.
First of all, we don't represent the index providers, but I think probably a lot of investors don't understand how the index models work and what's included in that.
Mr. Flood?
The important thing is transparency and disclosure, so we got to make sure that the appropriate disclosures are there for people to understand.
Do you think the average investor knows that when they're investing in these index funds that it's going off to Communist China because that's part of the index? And it's not even directly invested in a company, it's just in one of these VIEs?
Not without reading disclosures.
All right. Mr. Mas?
A great question. So I actually have, I'm an investor, and if my fund's going to China without proper disclosure or information, I wouldn't have any idea.
Yeah, thank you. Ms. Blass and Mr. Benson, in your view, are existing disclosure requirements adequate to clearly explain those ownership differences to investors?
So the disclosures themselves, yes, but they are dense, and are investors going to actually look for them? The answer is no. When you look at indexers and the rules of the road there and how they include these companies and whether these companies have the same obligations like U.S. companies in terms of disclosures, that is something actually that was looked at and has been continued to look at, and definitely the policymakers and regulators need to continue looking at that to safeguard American investments and retirement savings.
Agree with that.
You agree with her? Okay, great. I have concerns about how these VIE structures allow Chinese companies to raise capital in U.S. markets without being subject to the same ongoing disclosure, governance, and oversight standards that American companies face. Under the current rules, Chinese companies using VIE structures can still qualify as foreign private issuers. Mr. Benson, among all foreign private issuers, is it fair to say VIE issuers based in Communist China are the ones raising the most serious oversight and enforcement concerns for American investors?
I don't know that I can answer that, but what I can say is where we do have concerns, and I know you brought this up, is on low price, the low price securities and the impact that's had on investors and issues, and where the listing standards have not been, and the pump and dump schemes, exactly. And we thank you for bringing that up. We have raised that with the exchanges and the SEC repeatedly. To be fair, NASDAQ recently came out with revisions to, and we don't represent them. But they came out with revised listing standards, which we think is a step in the right direction to address the low price issue.
Well, this is an issue that's important to me, and I've raised it with Chairman Atkins. It's crucial that we get this right because we are putting, I think, investors' dollars at risk without their understanding what that risk is, and we're also helping to fund companies in our chief adversary in the world, and they are not playing by the same rules we are.
Let me tell you what actually happened in that hearing, because it was not what it looked like on the surface. On the surface, it looked like a senator giving a speech about China and index funds. What it actually was a senator forcing a panel of financial experts to sit in front of Congress and admit on the record that millions of Americans are funding Communist China's economy with their retirement savings and have absolutely no idea they're doing it. That is the part worth understanding. And I want to walk you through it carefully because the mechanism here is not simple, but once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Let's start with something most people don't think about when they open their 401k app. The United States capital markets are built on a promise. That promise is transparency. Every company that wants access to American investors has to play by American rules. Disclosure requirements, governance standards, regulatory oversight. That system is the reason American markets are the most trusted in the world. It is also the reason American retirement accounts have historically been a safe place to park your life savings. Now here is the part they don't tell you in the fund brochure. As of March 2025, approximately 286 China-based companies were listed on U.S. exchanges, with a combined market capitalization of roughly $1.1 trillion. That is not a rounding error. That is a number large enough to show up in your index fund, your mutual fund, your retirement account, by default, automatically, without you ever choosing it. And here is the question Ricketts walked into that hearing to ask. Do the rules that make American markets trustworthy actually apply to those companies? The short answer, and I want you to sit with this for a moment, is no, not in the same way. Not even close. Here is why, and I'll make this as clear as possible, because the legal structure is genuinely confusing, which, by the way, is not an accident. Chinese law restricts foreign ownership in key sectors of its economy. That means a Chinese company that wants to raise money from American investors cannot simply sell you equity in the actual operating company. The law won't allow it. So what do they do instead? They create a structure called a variable interest entity, a VIE. Here is what that means in plain terms. The actual Chinese company, the one doing business, the one generating revenue, stays off limits to foreign investors. What gets listed on the American exchange is a separate offshore holding company, usually registered somewhere like the Cayman Islands. That offshore company doesn't own the operating business. It is connected to it through a series of contracts. So when you buy shares in one of these companies, you are not buying ownership of anything in China. You are buying a piece of a shell company that holds a contract with a company in China. And that contract is governed by Chinese law, enforced by Chinese courts, and subject to the decisions of the Chinese Communist Party at any moment it chooses to intervene. Let that sink in for a second, because this is exactly where Ricketts turned to the expert panel and asked the question every American investor deserves to hear answered honestly. Does the average retail investor understand that difference? Not a trick question, not a gotcha. Just, does the person with a Fidelity account and a retirement timeline understand that what they're buying is not what they think they're buying? The answer came back from multiple experts in almost exactly the same words. No. One panelist said investors probably don't understand how index models work or what's included. Another said disclosures exist, but they're dense, and most investors are never going to look for them. A third one said it plainly. If my fund's going to China without proper disclosure, I wouldn't have any idea. Now I know what the counter-argument is because I've heard it. The information is technically available. The disclosures exist. If investors cared enough to look, they could find out. And that argument sounds reasonable until you understand what the disclosure system was actually built to do. It was not built to reveal that your investment operates under a fundamentally different legal framework than everything else in your portfolio. It was built for comparable companies, companies that file similar reports, face similar oversight, play by similar rules. VIE structured companies don't do that. They qualify as foreign private issuers, which means they face lower ongoing disclosure requirements than American companies. They don't have to meet the same governance standards. The regulatory oversight is thinner. The enforcement reach is shorter. So the disclosures that exist are describing a completely different kind of investment, buried in documents that the industry's own experts admitted no ordinary investor is going to read. That is not transparency. That is the architecture of plausible deniability. And this is where the conversation shifted from a financial policy debate into something considerably more serious. Because Communist China is not a regular foreign market participant. This is a state-directed economy where the line between a private company and government policy does not work the same way it does here. We have seen this play out in documented, concrete ways. Chinese technology companies compelled to hand over user data to the government. Companies pressured to realign their operations with state priorities. Executives who said the wrong thing publicly and then quietly vanished from view. The separation between a Chinese company and the Chinese Communist Party is not guaranteed by law, by contract, or by any mechanism that American investors or American regulators can actually enforce. Which means when American retirement savings flow into these companies by default, through index funds, through mutual funds, through the automatic contributions that ordinary working people make every single paycheck, a meaningful portion of that money is capitalizing entities that operate under the direction of a government that has explicitly named the United States its primary strategic competitor. I want to be precise here, because this point gets blurred in political debate. I'm not saying every Chinese company listed in the U.S. is a direct arm of the CCP. What I am saying is that the structure doesn't give American investors or American regulators the visibility to know which ones are and which ones aren't. And in that environment of opacity, the default for American retirement savings should not be automatic exposure. That is the argument behind the No China Index Funds Act. The logic is not complicated. If your index fund is going to hold Chinese Communist Party-linked companies, you should at minimum make that choice consciously, not have it made for you by the construction of an index you have never examined. There was also a second problem that surfaced in that hearing, one that connects to this same structural gap. Some China-based issuers have been linked to pump-and-dump schemes, manipulative trading patterns that exploit the thinner regulatory environment to move stock prices artificially and exit before ordinary investors can react. The experts acknowledge this. They said it has been raised with the SEC and the exchanges repeatedly. NASDAQ recently revised its listing standards, which they called a step in the right direction. But here is what I want you to notice about that answer. We are talking about a problem that everyone in that room acknowledged, that has been raised repeatedly, and that is still being worked on. The question is not whether the problem exists. Everyone agrees it does. The question is why it has been allowed to persist this long while American retirement savings sit inside it. So let me be clear about what this hearing actually was. This was not a partisan attack on China. This was not a protectionist argument against foreign investment. This was a hearing about whether the rules Americans trust to protect their savings actually apply to everything inside their portfolios. And the answer, confirmed by the industry's own experts under oath, is that for roughly $1.1 trillion worth of holdings, the rules apply differently. The oversight is thinner, the investor protections are weaker, and most people have no idea. That gap between what investors assume and what is actually true is not a technicality. It is a policy failure, and the consequences are not abstract. They show up in the retirement accounts of teachers and nurses and factory workers and anyone else who trusts that the financial system they're participating in is looking out for them. When industry experts sit before a Senate committee and confirm that investors don't understand where their money is going, That should be the end of the debate about whether something needs to change. The only remaining question is whether the people in those committee rooms have the will to actually change it. If you want to keep following these hearings and understand what's actually being decided beneath the political noise, subscribe to this channel, because this is where real policy gets made, quietly, in rooms most people aren't watching, and the consequences end up in your retirement account.